So with that, Bob, are you behind me soon?
Dr. Pike, do we have a name tag here for Dr. Pike?
I'm afraid
somewhere.
Don't need no name tags.
You are indeed notorious, but if we have one, we're going to find it in the drawer. We'll put it in front of you.
Good afternoon. I have only one slide since we needed a placeholder. Basically, I'd just like to talk to you for a bit. At the end, I do have a couple of photographs, so if you bear with me, you get to see the photographs.
Pull that mic up a little, just tilt it a bit back so it's a little higher. Thank you.
One of the reasons I have no slides is that the figures in the ESP report don't show very well at 8.5 by 11 or even when projected. And so I would encourage you, the council members, particularly the staff and other interested people, to go to this website, which I'm pointing at on the screen, where you'll find not only a full copy of the report, but you'll find high-resolution versions of the figures. As an engineer, it's always kind of irritating that we do a lot of work on a drawing that has detail in it, but it's hard to reproduce it in a standard size report. Our map of delta levees, I think, will stand the test of time and will be a valuable reference, as will be the recent DWR maps. They are not exactly the same thing, but they're quite compatible and consistent with each other. I'd like to make some quick acknowledgements, although I'm, for better or worse, the public face of this study on levees. My partners in crime were Mike Conrad, former commander of the Sacramento District of the Corps of Engineers, and Doug Gardner of Dangermont Group, who did all the GIS work. Also like to acknowledge the efforts of Ron Baldwin, who helped us respond to comments that the independent review panel made about our fairly brief at the time treatment of emergency preparedness, response, and recovery.
And that's been expanded significantly in the
Yes,
version.
yes, much of that done by Ron. Also like to thank Dave Mraz and others, including Steve Bradley at DWR. There may be a public perception that we're at loggerheads with DWR. That is not correct. We had great cooperation from Dave Mraz and Joel Dudas, who did all of the legwork on the DWR maps. We wouldn't have been able to complete our work as rapidly as we did if we hadn't had cooperation from Dave and Joel in particular. Also like to thank Reclamation District engineers who are still the real source of data as to levee conditions and current costs. Last but not least, like to thank Bob Gilbert and Bill Marcuson, the two engineer members of the independent review panel, for making constructive comments. Well, I guess I should disclose that Marcuson and I have been friends for almost 40 years, so he acted independently, however, since his comments were the hardest to deal with. Preconceptions going in. When Mike Conrad and I were asked to tackle this task, we had some familiarity with the Delta. Mike is former commander of Sacramento District. I had worked on a number of individual projects in the Delta. But the public preconceptions were of two kinds. One came from what I'll call the Doomsday School, because they use that term themselves, who said that there were 1,100 miles of levels in pitiful condition and that earthquakes, more extreme flood events, and sea level rise are not adequately addressed. The other preconception came from Reclamation District engineers who say a fair bit of money has already been invested in Delta levees since 1982, and they are really not in such bad shape. What did we find? Recall that the first time that Dr. Michael and I appeared before you, the chairman and I agreed that everyone is entitled to their own opinion, but not to their own facts. Our understanding of the facts has not changed since that time, in spite of both constructive and non-constructive reviews, but our understanding of the facts has in fact been confirmed by a couple of things that have emerged in the meantime, which I'll refer to as I go forward. Our basic findings relative to the preconceptions were that the Reclamation District engineers were correct in suggesting that the levees are today not in bad shape, as confirmed by the new DWR maps. Out of the 840 miles of levees in their maps, 514 miles by their count are already at the PL 8499 standard. They show 326 miles needing improvement up to PL 8499. We said 350 miles. The fact that there is this agreement should not be surprising to anyone because we're all working with the same basic data. When Mike Conrad and I first visited with Dave Mraz, those maps were on his desk, but he was not able to share them with us because of internal DWR considerations and because he was still engaged in a negotiation with RD engineers as to what would be put in the category of almost meets HMP. So even though we didn't actually have access to the maps, we knew from Dave and the RD engineers what the outcome would be. So we didn't exactly work together, but it's no surprise that we have a common understanding. The numbers are also generally consistent with the numbers that you saw this morning from the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan, but they're counting in slightly different categories, so all three of us have slightly different categories. That was one of the issues that Mike Conrad and I found in trying to get information from DWR, that there were like three different groups in DWR who didn't necessarily talk to each other, which is the answer to a question that someone asked a little bit earlier on. So that was the first of the findings, that the RD engineers were correct in suggesting that levees are today not in bad shape. But we also found, or pretty much knew before we started, that earthquakes, more extreme floods and possible sea level have not been adequately addressed. So it's not a matter of there being these two opposing camps that were saying different things and one being right and the other being wrong. There was merit to what both sides were saying. And those people, including more academic people, not registered engineers, but people with some knowledge of the issues, who said that in their opinion, earthquakes, more extreme floods, certainly more extreme than a 100-year flood, and possible sea level rise have not been adequately addressed, were in fact correct. And so part of our job was to see whether it was feasible to address those in terms of cost, programs, and so on. So our recommendations, you've heard before, but I'll run through them quickly again. First, that improvement of all delta levees to the delta-specific PL 8499 standard, which has in fact been the goal of the state and federal government since 1982, is appropriate and should be supported. Second one, that many what we called lowland levees, that is, levees that protect land below sea level, and selected other levees, should be improved to a new delta-specific standard with a crown width of 50 feet and a freeboard of at least 3 feet above the 100-year maximum water surface elevation. Such levees, in addition to being substantially more robust under earthquake and flood loading, called by one journalist fat levies, which is a term that seems to have caught on, and I might use that again, also provide for various what I might call adaptive engineering features, including improved emergency response, further raises to accommodate sea level rise as necessary, and the planting of vegetation on the waterside to provide connectivity of shaded riparian habitat throughout the delta. I'm not going to dwell on these. Dr. Michael is going to come back to some of them in the immediately following discussion. And then when we get to going through the proposal, I forget the jargon, phase by phase, theme by theme, then we can address questions in more detail. Third recommendation or conclusion was that there was a need for much improved coordination of emergency preparedness, response and recovery. And additional material on that question was added to the report as a result of suggestions from the independent review panel. Fourth conclusion recommendation, that there is an obvious trade-off between investments in more robust levees and improved emergency preparedness, response and recovery, and this trade-off could best be optimized by a Delta regional agency that is responsible for making rational and timely allocation of available funding. We, the consultants to the DPC, had and have no opinion on exactly who that should be, whether it should be you, the Delta Stewardship Council, our masters, the Delta Protection Commission, or someone else. That's more of a political question. But the advantages of having an entity that can make a rational allocation of how much goes into dirt and rock and how much goes into equally important but soft measures, emergency preparedness and so on, is a very important issue. And even though it's mostly done by DWR at present, it's done by different factions in DWR that don't necessarily speak to each other. And so just from the point of view of an engineer who likes to solve problems and move forward, even though it's ultimately a political question, it's an important one for you all to address. A little bit the same is true of the next and I think the last point under these recommendations, which is that detailed prioritization of future levy spending was beyond our scope and could best be handled by the same kind of Delta regional agency. However, we like to think that we made an important step forward by defining and emphasizing the importance of lowland levees, which we called out. We weren't the first people to do that. PPIC, who are sometimes viewed as being at loggerheads with ourselves, had almost exactly the same suggestion in 2007. They referred to core levies and then they changed the terminology to something else. There are, in fact, quite significant common elements of our work and the PPIC work, if you look for them. We also provided an appendix which shows graphically the islands with facilities that are most exposed to levee failures, and they're all consolidated in what I call the blue figure, which Dr. Michael just showed to you. The reason it's blue is that I'm colorblind and I get confused if you use red and green. That's why it's in blue. I'll just make one more point about prioritization. Prioritization obviously is important when you have funds to spend. Someone has to decide what the priority is. I don't think it's nearly as difficult as a lot of people make out. It doesn't require extensive calculations. Sure, it might be a very useful ongoing benchmark to have expected annual loss estimates for individual islands. But prioritization on a mathematical basis is essentially impossible to do. I have worked with the smartest people in this country on risk probability analyses, and now with one of the smartest people in the country on economic analyses. To do all this mathematically is pretty challenging. It doesn't require long studies. In half a day, if you got the right people in the room you could do a lot of the work on a common sense basis. And maybe if you push us on that, Dr. Michael and I will come back to that later on. But the point I just want to make is that it doesn't require endless studies to do prioritization. It requires application of existing knowledge and common sense more than anything else. Fourth and final area that I have to discuss is cost estimates. My notes say my original WAG. I'm not sure if I can explain in public what that stands for. My original rough estimate, off-the-cuff estimate, before Mike Conrad and I had our first meetings with Dave Mraz and others, my gut feel, if you like, was that for $5 billion you could solve the problem of long-term delta viability and levee stability. It turned out that it doesn't take $5 billion because of two factors. One is that when Mike Conrad and I toured around the delta and talked to people, we found that the delta levees, while they obviously still need work, were in better condition than we thought and that had been portrayed in public, in newspaper articles and editorials and so on. If you make a judgment based on newspaper articles and editorials, it might well have cost $5 billion to improve the delta levee system. The other factor that we discovered, although I already knew something of this, was that construction costs in the delta are much lower than national averages and much lower than in places like New Orleans, where after Katrina they did reconstruction on a congressionally mandated deadline with very extreme constraints on what they could do. And so it turned out that the estimates that are based on actual spending in the Delta, confirmed by Mike Conrad, who is a licensed contractor and has a contracting business, indicated that assuming that there are existing funds from Proposition 84 and 1E to complete the upgrades to PL 8499, beyond that, it will only take $1 to $2 billion to improve from 300 to 600 miles of levees to the FAT levee standard. That's lower than a lot of people expect, but it's because it's mostly moving earth, some rock, but a lot of the rock's already in place. Moving earth is a relatively cheap thing to do. And there are not that many complications in the central part of the delta. Now, that estimate of $1 to $2 billion, which is spelled out a little bit more in the final report in response to questions from the independent review panel, as I said to the panel, if I were in your shoes, which I am from time to time on similar panels, I would ask exactly the same question. I would look at myself and I would say, Dr. Pike, how confident are you of your numbers? And I would look at myself back again and I'd say, we've done our homework, we're very confident of the numbers. But that estimate of $1 to $2 billion assumes that work is done largely by the reclamation districts with some centralized coordination. And when we had a sort of official meeting with Joe and DWR staff down in Stockton some months back, Joe quite properly asked the question, what about overall program cost? What you're talking about is just an engineering and construction cost. A lot of people think the engineering cost is estimated on the low side. That's not correct. The engineering cost that's built in here is low relative to the engineering costs on the early improvement program, improvements of levees in the Natomas district and elsewhere. But there are much more complicated issues in those cases, including multiple landowners, 20,000 landowners instead of a handful of landowners, all of which you have to negotiate with. So there is a reason why our engineering and construction costs are lower. But Joe's question about overall program cost was a very good question, because overall programs like rebuilding the Bay Bridge and so on tend to blow up for many reasons. I guess the Central Artery Tunnel in Boston is a classic example. Started out at $2 billion, ended up at 14. The New Bay Bridge is actually very similar. Started out at $2 billion. They don't even disclose the real number today, but I think it's something like 14 billion. But that doesn't have to happen. And so Jeff and I decided, after kicking this around a bit, that our advice to the Delta Protection Commission would be that for program purposes, to allow for some inefficiencies that result from state and federal government involvement, and to allow for the addition of further ecosystem restoration measures, additional to simple planting of vegetation on the water side of the fat levees. That's already included in the 1 or 2 billion, not the trees. I don't know how much trees cost, but I don't think the cost of the trees is a big issue. But to the extent that ecosystem restoration requires significant setback of levees onto completely new alignments, that's a cost which is not included in the 1 to 2 billion. And for these reasons, some loss of efficiency from the optimum, and the fact that in the levy cost, whoever's responsible for the funding might have to bear some of the cost of ecosystem restoration measures, which you could argue should be otherwise allocated. We thought, well, let's double the upper end of the number. We'll go up to 4 billion. By coincidence, I can safely say it's by coincidence, Jeff and I independently, within a day of each other, went back to the 2007 PPIC report, who by a slightly different path had come to exactly the same number, $4 billion. So rightly or wrongly, this is quite common in engineering. When you have two things pointing to the same number, you say, well, that's the number, and you stop thinking at that point. So we did no further analysis after we got to the 4 billion number. But in the 2 or 3 months that have passed since that day, neither Jeff nor I think, have uncovered any substantial reason to say, no, 4 billion is not enough as a program number. It should be even higher than that. But we've spelled out what the constraints are, make certain assumptions about how the work is done. It assumes limited use of import material, except that the Port of Stockton ship channel deepwater dredging is slated sometime in the future to spin off 50 million cubic yards of material. That material, as far as an island-by-island study is concerned, is import material, but dredge material can be moved very cheaply and placed very cheaply. It still has to be graded and compacted, which they didn't do in the old days, but the cost of moving that 50 million cubic yards of material, grading and compacting it, is all included in the original $1 to $2 billion. That's not an increment. The independent review panel, as most people are aware, questioned whether our cost estimates were optimistically low. That's the exact language that they used. Based on their knowledge of post-Katrina levee improvements in New Orleans, it turns out that Colonel Conrad previously had worked in New Orleans, is very familiar with the conditions there. I've been involved in post-Katrina levee improvements in New Orleans, and so we know in quite some detail the reasons why costs in New Orleans, which the IRP cited as $50 million a mile, are just way, way high. And again, well, if I'd been on the review panel, I wouldn't have made the same analogy, but I would have asked the question, how sure are you? Our estimates are also consistent with the recent construction of levee improvements on Jones Tract as part of the Aqueduct Protection Program. Oh, can I go back to the slides? So this is the first of 4 slides. We've lost the edges of it. This just shows a grader and truck during construction, just to show that it actually takes some equipment to do this stuff, because the next 3 slides are all after the improvements are completed and you can't see anyone working on them. This is actually a section of levee that was being slightly raised and widened out to 22 feet crown width, accommodating 2 lanes of traffic, which is highly desirable for emergency response purposes. And you can see that these levees are capable of carrying heavy traffic and so on. If there was a failure, you can actually run trucks in there. The levees are not the most highly engineered structures in the world, but they're really not bad. The PL 8499 standard actually only calls for a minimum of 16 feet, but Delta engineers and reclamation districts have routinely been expanding that to 22 feet to provide all-weather 2-lane access. And they overbuild the PL 8499 standard, which calls for 18 inches above 100-year water surface elevation by a foot to allow for at least some settlement. Our report suggests that there is, in fact, before you go to the fat levee standard, which you need to do only for the most critical levees, a kind of PL 8499 plus standard, which has almost become a de facto standard, which has 22-foot crown width and might have 3 feet freeboard above the 100-year water surface elevation. If you don't have liquefiable materials in the levee or the foundation, that PL 8499 plus standard levee is probably a 500-year levee. And that is an appropriate level of protection for many of the levees in the Delta. Let me just finish off with an example of a fat levee, however. This is on Upper Jones Tract, heading north just before you get to the McCollamy Aqueduct crossing. You can't see it very clearly in this slide, but the Blacktop Road is actually over here. That was the existing levee. You'll see that more clearly in the subsequent slides. What you can see in this slide is the addition of 20 plus feet of material on the landslide and the new landslide slope. So this doesn't quite meet the Conrad Pike definition of a fat levee, but it almost does. It's at least 42-foot crown width, and it's been constructed to 2 or 3 feet above 100-year maximum water surface elevation. This is just looking back in the other direction. Again, in this projection, unfortunately, you can't see the river too well. This is adjacent to actually a very nice section of the Middle River that has mid-channel islands with tules growing in it. And this is one of the sections where Department of Fish and Game wanted the reclamation districts to provide shaded riverine habitat to supplement the habitat that already existed in the Middle River. The original drawings actually provided for doing that by not building what I would call a real setback levee on a new alignment, but by building what I call a rollback levee, which means taking the material in the existing levee and moving it over kind of the width of a levee to the interior, so that where the old levee sat, you have a bench on which you can plant vegetation. But as that well-known graduate in civil engineering of the University of Santa Clara, Dante John Nomolini, said at your last meeting, the drawback of doing that is that you shift your levee from a foundation that's already consolidated to a foundation that's not consolidated. And so to some extent in the field, they figured out that at lower cost, they could just add a new levee on the inside of the existing levee, which is exactly the fat levee concept. And that meant that the existing levee could be planted with vegetation to accomplish what Department of Fish and Game were looking for, in fact, without actually sacrificing anything in terms of levee robustness. Councilmember Nordoff was asking Eileen White and Dan Nomolini this question at your last meeting. The more complete answer to Hank's question is that as long as it's not in the upper part of the levee, the vegetation actually improves the stability of the levee. Everyone's aware that the Corps of Engineers has this national policy of eliminating vegetation from levees. That still stands as national policy, but it's basically driven by one person who saw a light in the sky or something after Katrina and said, we've got to enforce this existing policy that's on our books. There are a lot of people in the Corps of Engineers who don't agree with that policy, and the most recent report from technical people in the Corps of Engineers, from ERDEC, the research organization, concludes that vegetation in the lower part of the levee is beneficial to levee robustness and stability. But vegetation in the upper part might be adverse. It's only might be adverse, but in the upper part, if a tree falls over, it might pull part of the top of the levee with it. But in the lower part of the levee, the reinforcing effect of roots is what sometimes geotechnical engineers do deliberately. We call it vegetative reinforcement. And so this idea that vegetation on levees is necessarily bad for levees is, from the technical point of view, simply incorrect. I think I'm running over long, but I have one more slide that just emphasizes the width of this levee on Upper Jones Track. You can see the existing roadway, and then the unpaved portion is the new extension. And this is very close to being the fat levee that we recommended. This happens to be my car that's sitting on the levee, but as someone said, you could park 2 tractor-trailer rigs on that extension of the levee. It also serves as a wonderful viewing platform for snow geese who are presently wintering on Jones Tract. And if you look the other side, there's a rather nice stretch of the middle river. So robust levees are not incompatible with habitat. Very final point is, what did that cost? Our estimate for construction of a fat levee is from $2 to $3 million a mile. These little stretches cost something like $2.6 million a mile, within our range, but no reflection on now lawyer Nomolini or engineer Nudek and others who worked on this project. But if you do projects piecemeal and use imported fill, the costs are higher than if you run a big program with an overall program manager that arranges a source of borrow material and so on. So this was $2.6 million, but the cost of the dirt was at the high end of the cost of dirt. On some of the other aqueduct protection projects, they're actually barging material from Decker Island for particular reasons for those projects, but again, that's putting the cost at the high end. Although I happened to see one of those barges going down 3 Mile Slough late one evening and made for a very scenic photograph.